Thank you everyone for coming out to this first OpenStack Day in the Nordics. I also want to thank the organizers and the programming committee. If any of you have ever put on events, you know that it is a lot of work, and you know it takes a lot longer than just this day that we're here for them to put all of this together. So thank you very much for their efforts. As Martin said, I'm Jonathan Bryce. I'm the executive director at the OpenStack Foundation. And how many of you are, I guess to start off with, how many of you are familiar with OpenStack? Okay, good. So most of you are. This is good. You'd be surprised, you know. We go places and people are still very early on in understanding it. What about with the OpenStack Foundation itself? Okay, a lot fewer. So OpenStack is a really big open source project that is based all over the world. We have people who contribute and participate in OpenStack in almost 180 different countries, and so it's really huge, people all over. And the OpenStack Foundation that I work for and a few other people who are here today work for is a nonprofit that is also based globally. We have people in Hungary, in France, in Taiwan, in Australia, and in the United States. And what we do is we spend our time organizing the efforts of that very large global community. And we do that in a few different ways. We support events like this one, where we go around the world. We have about 35 OpenStack days like this every year. We also throw a couple of very large events called the OpenStack Summit. And our last one was in Austin, Texas at the end of April. We had 7,800 people there from 60 different countries. So you know, these are serious events where we get together people who are using OpenStack, about 1,500 of the software developers who actually contribute code to OpenStack, people who are business decision makers who are trying to understand, you know, what they should do for their cloud strategy, and we bring all of them together in this one event for a week, and it's a lot of fun. People share a lot of information and you know, learn a lot, and then go back to their businesses all over the world and implement it. So our next big OpenStack Summit is going to be in Barcelona in just about a month, in October, at the end of October, October 25th. And so that's the next time that we're doing one of these big events. But the other thing that we do at the OpenStack Foundation is we help to organize different working groups within the community. Some of those focus on users. We have a user committee that organizes operators and different working groups that collect feedback and requirements, help to get those in the development cycle. We also support the infrastructure that manages the open source contributions themselves, and the release cycle and the process that we go through to create the software. And you know, we do also work with the ecosystem, because there's a very large commercial ecosystem around OpenStack that takes the upstream software that the open source developers create and turn it into products and services. And so those sponsors that Andreas and Oscar were talking about, you know, those companies all have products and services that are based on OpenStack, and you can use OpenStack in a lot of different ways. So you know, if you are you're kind of trying to figure out the OpenStack landscape, there's a web page that we maintain at openstack.org/marketplace that lists some of the different ways that you can use OpenStack and some of the different products and services that are out there. So that's a pretty good resource to go look at. But I wanted to talk quickly about the software and just give you a little information about that to set the tone. And then I want to talk about some users, and then just some trends that are driving OpenStack usage in businesses all over the world. So to start off with, our last release was called OpenStack Mitaka. We name our releases after the places that we have our OpenStack summits, and so this was a release that was planned in Japan, in Tokyo, and so it was codenamed Mitaka. And this release was developed by over 2,000 developers, 2,300 developers. And you know, as I mentioned, OpenStack is open source software. And what is really cool about that is that these developers came from all over the world and also from many, many different companies, from almost 350 different organizations. And this is one of the things that's very powerful about open source, and that is honestly a lot of fun about being part of the OpenStack community. We have companies who are really competitors in the marketplace, like HP and IBM and Dell and others that come together in the open source community to collaborate. And this can sometimes be a really interesting and unusual phenomenon for people who are not as familiar with the open source world. But it's actually extremely powerful when you get together a broad coalition of companies who have a variety of users and all kinds of different use cases to come together and build something that they all are basing their businesses off of. And so that's really cool to see. And we have companies that people sometimes are surprised to hear about involved in OpenStack, like VMware, for instance. VMware has a very strong position in the virtualization market. And when OpenStack first got started, people kind of positioned VMware and OpenStack as competitors or as incompatible. But OpenStack has supported VMware hypervisors for years, pretty much since the beginning. VMware contributes to OpenStack. They're one of the organizations that contribute to every release. And they also have an OpenStack product called VMware Integrated OpenStack. If you followed VMworld a couple of weeks ago, you might have seen that one of their featured speakers was Nike. And Nike talked about running some of their retail operations on top of VMware's OpenStack product. They used it to process $8 billion in sales. So, serious usage on top of OpenStack through VMware. So that's what's really cool about open source. You have to kind of change the way that you think about competition and how products interact. Because really what we're trying to do is we're trying to build a baseline technology that supports many, many different workloads and that everyone can benefit from. And yes, companies will build businesses and make money and sell products and services on top of that. So, this release was really focused on manageability, scalability, and improving the user experience. OpenStack is about 6 years old now. And so in the first 2 or 3 years of that, it was very rapid feature development. Lots and lots of features coming into every release. But over the last couple of years, what we've seen is a big uptick in production usage. And if you're using a piece of software in production, you don't necessarily want it changing out from underneath you constantly. You want some stability, you want easier tools, easier to manage. And so that's what the last couple of releases have really been focused on. We do a survey every 6 months. And our most recent survey, which we did in April, we asked people what stage their deployment's in. And 65% of those deployments were used for production workloads. And kind of, to that point that the software has been maturing really rapidly, that was 33% more than just a year ago in terms of the number of productions, the percentage of productions or deployments that were in production. So this is really cool how we see these things coming together now, where this open source community has built great technology, but is also really maturing it for serious business use. Another thing that came out of that survey that was really interesting was we asked people what was driving their usage of OpenStack. And this was one of the really broadly picked options, was a standard set of APIs across a wide variety of technology. Again, things like VMware and KVM together, different kinds of hardware, storage from EMC and NetApp. Having an API that allows you to work with all of that, and also use emerging technologies like containers, platform as a service, all in one framework. That's really powerful. So this is something that we take very seriously, this kind of interoperability. And at the OpenStack Foundation, another program that we administer is called OpenStack Powered. And this is a set of tests. It tests over 220 different API capabilities and has a set of requirements around what code products and services must include in order to be able to use the name OpenStack. So if you are are working with a vendor, this is an important thing to see, to make sure that they are passing the OpenStack powered compliance test, because then you know that you're not going to kind of get stuck and be only able to use products and services from that single vendor. Because that's really the power of a technology platform like OpenStack, is the ability to work with different providers, have leverage, have some additional control over your supply chain. So a couple other things. This is another stat that we talked about in Austin. We now have half of the Fortune 100 using OpenStack. And if you look at some of the companies that spoke at that event in Austin, Walmart, AT&T, China Mobile, State Grid of China, Volkswagen. It's 5 different companies. Do you know what they all have in common? Each of them is the biggest company in the world in their market. The biggest retailer, the biggest mobile company, the biggest carrier, the biggest power company, the biggest car manufacturer. And they all use OpenStack. And what was really interesting about it is when they spoke in Austin, each of them talked about how that was a strategic decision that they made at high levels of leadership in their company. And we're going to get into why I think this is a trend that we're seeing all over the world in just a minute. But it's not just massive companies. There are also small and medium businesses. There are telecom providers. There are public cloud providers. You have public cloud providers here in Sweden that are running on OpenStack. And there are a lot of academic and research usage that is really pushing the envelope of science and research on top of OpenStack. And one of the keynote speakers later this morning, Jan from CERN, is going to talk about what CERN is doing with OpenStack. They're one of the longest users of OpenStack, and they do really awesome stuff at really large scale with it. So that's going to be cool to hear from. Public clouds all over the world. I think Monty's actually going to talk a little bit about this, so I won't say too much about it. But what is driving all of this? I think that, why would these companies, biggest companies in the world, think that this piece of open source technology is strategic to what they do? And I think it's because, we're seeing a disruption in business globally right now. And that's something that can be very frightening. It can be scary when things get disrupted. But those are also the times of greatest opportunity, when big shifts happen in markets. And there are a few things that I think are driving these disruptions, both in technology and also in the broader market and the broader economy globally. I think that one of the things that we see with technology specifically is that IT environments are becoming more diverse. It's not a situation anymore where we go to a single vendor and we buy hardware networking gear from them, we get software, we get everything integrated. We're putting together a lot of different components in our data center. We're putting together a lot of different software components on top of that. And more people want new technologies. They want to bring their own devices. They want to use public cloud, and they want to mix it all together. And so being able to manage that diversity is a really strategic issue for all of us who are in the technology industry. And that's one of the things that OpenStack does really well. It helps you manage diversity in IT. And so I want to cover quickly 3 points that can help you take advantage of diversity in IT and embrace it. Because to me, that is one of the key strategies that technology leaders need to think about. It's not how do you crush the diversity, because that slows you down and leaves you at a competitive disadvantage. It's really how do you embrace it and manage it so that you are able to move more quickly and compete globally. So the first thing that I think is important is to pick standard platforms, and pick platforms that standardize base components but let you iterate and have flexibility on top of that. And if you look at everything that happens in the technology world, ultimately, it needs what a computer does, right? It needs compute, storage, and networking so it can process, store, and move data around. And as you look at how these things get delivered, I think you can kind of break them up into some different tiers that every application can take advantage of. You have infrastructure primitives that give you that basic compute, storage, and networking. That's kind of the area where OpenStack plays. Then you also have what I call application primitives. And those might be a little bit more abstracted, like a relational database as a service, maybe some kinds of platform technologies. And then, as you go higher up the stack, you get to cloud-native apps and cloud-native frameworks, things like Kubernetes, Mesos, Docker tools, the things that really completely abstract away all of the concepts of infrastructure underneath it. Now, if you look at each of these layers, there are commercial options. There are also open source options. And to me, one of the things that's important to consider is how do you pick something that works well with the layers above and below it and gives you flexibility and choice over the next decade. Because the iteration cycles in technology are just speeding up. I mean, look at how quickly virtualization came and is now already being replaced by cloud. These cycles are happening within 5 or 6 years. So you really have to think about how do you pick technologies that are flexible and can be extended. A really big OpenStack user is SAP. SAP, obviously one of the biggest enterprise software companies in the world. And they've been using OpenStack internally for quite a while, and they also are building products on top of OpenStack to support manufacturing, to support Industry 4.0. What's pretty interesting to see, though, is the way that they have architected their products. They basically have followed this pattern where they have OpenStack as kind of the base common framework at the lowest level of everything they build now. And then on top of that, they use a platform as a service set of tools that's based around Cloud Foundry. And then on top of that, they can build all kinds of different purpose-specific applications. Nayaki Nayar, she spoke about this at a recent OpenStack event. And the use case that she was talking about was Siemens MindSphere, which is an industrial control application used to run manufacturing systems. So this is a production use case that they have right now that's running on top of OpenStack, Cloud Foundry, and then Siemens MindSphere. And the thing that's great about it is it lets the software developers inside of SAP, inside of Siemens, and also inside of their manufacturing organizations move really quickly because they have these clear layers of standardization that they can develop to. The second thing to remember is new apps, they still need old applications. And the data, a lot of times, that comes from those old legacy, quote unquote, legacy applications is really one of the most valuable assets that every organization has. So as you build new apps, you have to think about how do you connect these systems together. And this is something that many businesses face. Mario Mueller, who is an IT director at Volkswagen, talked about how in Volkswagen, they have hundreds of locations all over the world. They have lots and lots of legacy systems that they have to continue to maintain. But they are also facing an incredibly competitive environment because what's happening in the auto industry right now? It's autonomous cars, it's in-car entertainment. It's not just about manufacturing a physical good anymore. If you want to be a great car company, you can't just be a great manufacturer. You now have to be a technology company. And so they have implemented OpenStack so that they are able to give their software development teams the infrastructure and the environment that they need to compete with Tesla and Google and Apple and these other great technology companies that have entered their market. At the same time, they are able to use those solid, stable base components of OpenStack to support their existing infrastructure and their existing environments. And by doing that, they're able to connect them together and take advantage of the real value that they have in that data and in those old applications within those new applications as well. And the third one, which I think is really, at this point, the most important one, is remembering that culture and people are always more important than technology. And this is an example that I love that a user came and talked to me about. He said that they were in a situation where it took them 44 days to go from code complete to new software in the hands of their customer on a service that they were running. And so they said, that's not terrible, but it could be a lot better. And there are a lot of companies out there that are doing continuous deployment. They're deploying multiple times a day, hundreds of times a week, and they were doing deployments in 44 days. So they said, we need a cloud. And they came and they built a cloud. They used OpenStack. It went well. They got it out. They started having their developers use it, and they were able to drop this time to 42 days. Not the result they were hoping for. And he said, so they went back and they were like, okay, we got a cloud. That's what we needed. But they realized that they had built a cloud, but they hadn't changed any of their business processes. So even though they had a cloud, if the developer wanted a server on the cloud, they still had to fill out a piece of paper. The piece of paper had to go around and get signatures, had to get sign off in different departments. And so they basically removed all of the value of the cloud by keeping in place their existing culture and processes. So they went back and they got an architecture review from their security team and their network team so that resources could be provisioned automatically in certain networks. They got everybody to sign off on self-service, all this kind of thing, and they were able to then drop that to a couple of hours for deployment. So you have to remember that technology is critical to enabling this change, but you have to think about how you make sure that your culture is able to take advantage of the technology. AT&T is the largest integrated carrier in the world, and I know they do a lot of business with some Swedish companies as well. And they are facing a big change right now because their business is changing dramatically. Since the iPhone came out, data usage on their network increased 150,000%. And this was on what was already the largest network in the world. Think about that. I mean, that means that they are now in a completely different business than they were 10 years ago. So the same procurement process for hardware, for maintenance, for management of their network, it just doesn't work in their business model anymore. And so they are working on going to network functions virtualization. And this is a trend that's happening all across the telecom industry. And it's early days, but AT&T has already rolled out 100 data centers in production with OpenStack running customer workloads. Other companies are doing this in the telecom industry as well. But one of the things that they always talk about when they talk about this change is what they have to do culturally inside of their company too. And so they are offering training and reskilling for everyone in their company so that as they move to this more virtualized world and more virtualized usage of their network, they're going to be able to take real advantage of it and move their company with them. And that is a huge task for a company of AT&T size. But they recognize that they can't just pretend that things are going to go fine and that nothing's going to change their business. So it's a really exciting story to see developing in the telecom industry. So picking standard platforms, kind of giving standard places to develop and target, really important. Making sure that you connect old apps and new apps together, and thinking about culture. Those are three things that allow you to kind of satisfy the competing priorities of stability, maintaining legacy critical systems, but also moving more quickly and embracing diversity, and really taking advantage of this disruption. The other big trend that I see that's driving things like OpenStack is that demand for infrastructure is just exploding. Everywhere we go, what we hear about are increasing needs for compute, increasing needs for data management. We've been able to hit a couple of events on this trip. We were in Bristol, Amsterdam. We went to Cambridge University, talked with them about the square kilometer array, about some biomedical and gene sequencing work they're doing. And they're talking about systems that do 250 petaflops of compute that they're building out over the next few years on top of OpenStack. That is an amazing amount of compute power. And the data streams coming off of things like the square kilometer array are unbelievable. We'll hear some of the stats from CERN too that are happening today, on top of OpenStack. So this demand for infrastructure just keeps exploding. one of the things that's also driving this is Internet of Things, IoT. 50 billion devices is actually kind of a middle of the road estimate for what we're going to see by 2020. There are already billions of devices, and all of those devices, what do? They generate data and they push it around a network, and in most cases they push it off to a set of infrastructure that's then supposed to do more processing on it. And there was an analyst that did some research, and he estimated that these devices, as they process, store, move massive amounts of data, that we would need another 400 million servers in the next 10 years to handle it. Now that seems high to me, but it's a bold number, so I like to put it on the slide. But let's say that it's half of that, or a quarter of that, 100 million servers. I mean, that's a lot of servers. I used I started the public cloud at Rackspace, and I've run data centers and infrastructure that had tens of thousands of servers, and that was a big pain. That's really hard. You think about 100 million servers or 400 million servers. You cannot manage those servers the way that we used to. When I first started working with Linux, and every server you log into it, the command line, and you set it up, and you install things, and you log out, and you log into the next. It doesn't work with 100 million servers. So what we have to have is programmable access to all of these different systems. And it's clear that this is again going to be a diverse environment. Those compute resources are going to be made up of bare metal. They're going to be made up of virtual machines. They're going to be made up of containers. And so you need a system that can handle all of that. And that's why when we think about OpenStack, and when you look at the way that it's architected, very pluggable, very flexible, so that you can integrate many technologies. And since we started, the use cases have already really expanded from the initial basic use cases that we started with to where we are now. And we've really built this integration engine that allows you to use what's available today, but be ready to take advantage of what's coming over the next decade. The other thing, though, that we talk about is how we can't do this alone. I think that one of the most powerful sets of technology that has come about in kind of the last 20 years was the LAMP stack. And those were 4 different open source technologies that were developed in different communities. There were some different licenses in there. They were managed differently in terms of how they were written and released. But when you put them together, what you did is you enabled an entire new breed of application to be built, the web application. Before the LAMP stack, most of the World Wide Web was just static HTML. And that's kind of what people thought of the internet as. When the LAMP stack became ubiquitous, there were tens of millions of web applications that were developed. And we are on the cusp of, I think, enabling tens of millions of cloud applications right now that take advantage of 5G networks, IoT, machine learning. All of these things, what we need to have breakthroughs in these areas are mass amounts of programmable infrastructure. And so OpenStack is definitely a piece of that, but I think that as we look at what the LAMP stack of the cloud is going to be, it's going to be more than that. From our user survey, we see that these are trends that people are really interested in. The number one thing is containers. And if you look at what people are using today on top of OpenStack, these are the technologies that they're combining. 6 months ago, this list was very different. And I think what that shows is that it's very early right now in the container market. But all of these work with OpenStack. And this is something that again gets to that integration engine concept. Whether you're using Kubernetes or Cloud Foundry or Docker Data Center or whatever, there are ways that you tie all of these together, and you get a really powerful combination that allows cloud application developers to build cool things. More users. That was Time Warner Cable. This is a company out of the Czech Republic. These guys are using Mesos and Kubernetes on top of OpenStack. Craig McCluskey from Google, Alex Polvu from CoreOS, they have integrated OpenStack and Kubernetes to provide a new management layer to add resiliency to OpenStack services. So where is it all going to go? I think that this is an area that we're going to see a lot of really cool updates in, but the big point is that it's not just going to be OpenStack, it's going to be OpenStack and other technologies. So we say collaborate or die is kind of the key word for this space in the technology world right now. So just to wrap up, if you are interested in kind of understanding the framework that OpenStack operates in, how to apply it in your business, we have some material that we've started to put together on our website. You can go to openstack.org/enterprise and find a lot of cool things that are not just about the technology, but also about the culture and the business decisions that you need to consider. You know, should you really build a cloud? How should you do it? You know, things like that. And that's a really good resource to go to. If you are already running OpenStack or you're looking to make that your career, we've launched a new certification called the Certified OpenStack Administrator. This is just a few months old, and we've had hundreds of people who have already gone through this process. And there are many job openings all over the world for OpenStack administrators, and we're really trying to help bridge that technology gap with this and other programs. And finally, I mentioned Barcelona, October 25th. If you just want to totally immerse yourself in OpenStack, this is the best place to do it. If you can't get to Barcelona, then we're doing it again in Boston in May of next year, and maybe we can see you there. But I'm really excited to be here, and thank you again to the organizers and to all of you for coming. And hopefully I'll get to talk to many of you today. Thank you.